I'm going to go ahead and get started with the second panel of speakers. It is my privilege to introduce the moderator for our second panel of speakers today, Professor Matt Lampkin. Professor Lampkin joined the TU College of Law after 2 years as a fellow at Stanford Law School's Center for Law and the Biosciences. Prior to entering academia, he was in private practice in Chicago and Illinois, clerked for a federal judge, and worked as a policy advisor to the mayor of Indianapolis. Professor Lampkin's scholarship explores the intersection of healthcare, law, and ethics, with a particular focus on how the increasing commercialization of medical care is reshaping our understanding of disease and disability, informed consent and personal responsibility, and the role of government in regulating medical care. Please join me in welcoming Professor Matt Lampkin.
Thanks very much. We are now beginning the dark suits and beards section. Misidentified on the schedule as healthcare philosophy. I have the privilege of introducing two very distinguished speakers. It is also something of a challenge because their list of accomplishments is sufficiently long that if I attempted to take you through them, they wouldn't have any time to speak. So I hope that they and you will forgive me for leaving off vast swaths of those accomplishments in my introductory remarks. Our first speaker is Talha Syed. He's assistant professor of law at Berkeley Law School, where he teaches IP, health law, legal theory, and torts. His research interests include legal theory and political philosophy, with a particular focus on intellectual property and innovation, including a co-authored publication in Yale Law Journal this year, as well as allocation of healthcare resources, a subject he's going to be discussing today. Professor Syed has a BA from the University of Western Ontario, an LLB from the University of Victoria, and is an SJD candidate at Harvard Law School, where he was also an academic fellow at the Petrie-Flom Center for Health Law Policy, Biotechnology, and Bioethics. Today he's going to be discussing rights versus distributive approaches to allocating healthcare.
Slide. I'm just going to put this up. Do me the ignorance, Judy, shutting that thing down. All right, thanks. All right, great. So I'm actually going to follow on a bit of what. Yes. So yeah.
Should we flip the order? I'm sorry, I must have gotten the order wrong.
I can blanket it.
That's good. I don't mind.
That's not distracting, right?
There we go. No, that's not distracting. I don't know what that. Yeah.
Come to see that name up there. Yeah.
So I'm actually going to speak on the same piece that Chris spoke about this morning, Einer's 1994 piece, Allocating Healthcare Morally. I'm going to talk about it from a normative philosophical perspective. I just want to echo Chris's remarks about how seminal and wide-ranging this article is. I think it represents Einer at his best, a high-powered master of all trades, showing complete felicity with moral philosophy, economics, and doing something he calls comparative paradigm analysis, which I don't think you've ever picked up on again, but I guess that's Einer's idea of what good legal scholarship is. It's a kind of attempt to master a number of disciplines and then bring them to bear on specific institutional policy questions, and I don't think there's many scholars today who do it as well as Einer. So what I want to quickly recap is some of the core claims of Einer's piece, and then the part that I'm going to take off on, building on his work, and also to some extent offering a friendly amendment / critique of one aspect of it. So Einer's claim is that to some extent we need to have some redistribution of healthcare resources in healthcare because of a social discomfort with allocating healthcare according to market purchasing power, to each according to willingness and ability to pay, and so therefore healthcare does involve some redistribution. It involves redistribution according to income, but also to some extent in terms of health status, and I'll talk about that in a minute. The way to deal with the trade-offs that healthcare involves, Einer rightly points out, can't be resolved through some sort of moral absolutism that every health increment that can be purchased should be purchased, because that'll lead to a bottomless pit of spending on healthcare, and that there's an inadequacy of any alternative technical medical criteria of health need. All criteria ultimately involve opportunity costs with respect to different social allocation of resources among patients or among health and other alternatives. And finally, Einar has, I think, incredibly persuasive and very subtle critiques of the two alternative approaches that philosophers tend to be attracted to when dealing with healthcare questions, to the one that he then half-heartedly embraces, which are, so the approach that I'm going to talk about and that I'm going to offer a friendly amendment to is the idea that ultimately rationing in healthcare has to involve some kind of forthright commitment to measuring and trading off different health benefits across different patients in the population. So I'm going to call that, I guess, sort of a benefit measurement and trading off. Whether or not we should do benefit maximization is a separate question, but the idea is we need some sort of systematic way of evaluating different health outcomes and trading them off against different patients and different needs and different life stages. So this systematic approach is contrasted with two others that moral philosophers are often drawn towards. One is random, lottery, coin flipping, using cues or other mechanisms to deal with these questions. And Einar's critique, I think, of this is very persuasive, very subtle, very powerful, and I'm not going to speak on it much except to bring it up near the end as a problematic aspect of his own approach, which was all connected at some point. And the other thing that Einar, I think, very powerfully critiques is the idea that you can deal with these normative questions, these social policy questions, simply by recourse to individual consent. And I'll say why that doesn't work, and Einar's critique of that is very persuasive on that front as well, I think. And so now just to, I guess, basically set up where I'm going. Einar suggests, I think, interestingly, that the overall budget for healthcare should probably be set around the overall budget of a socially provided healthcare right should be what the average middle-class income purchaser would provide for themselves. And then within that overall budget, each individual should choose among different plans, which each offer a different menu of group health maximization. And then the plans are reimbursed according to how many enrollees they have, with a risk adjustment for the enrollee's pre-existing health status, so that plans don't have the incentive to only enroll healthy patients, but that if they enroll patients with pre-existing tendencies towards illness, that will be reflected in their reimbursements. Fundamentally, I want to frame the problem with Einar's solution being the lack of clarity with how to go about doing the risk adjustment for people with differential health needs. And so now, just to frame the issue that I want to discuss today, it's as follows. I understand health to be a particularly important area of a general question in moral philosophy of justice, which is unchosen differential needs. People who have health needs, or say needs in educational resources, owing to personal capacities and the social cost of meeting those needs, which are higher than average due to no fault of their own. People with disability of some sort of dysfunction or pain that is less than the social average, which they haven't earned, which requires, if they are to be brought up to the average, greater resources than for other people. Unchosen differential needs. And what I want to suggest is that this is probably the sharpest question that distributively or morally that healthcare raises. And what I want to do is provide what I understand to be a systematic approach to this question, as opposed to more ad hoc approaches. And then within the systematic approach, argue for a distributive justice approach, which is in contrast with two alternative distributive justice approaches, which can be called maximization or utilitarianism and equality. So I want to contrast the approach I'm going to advance with maximization and equality. Okay. So just now to set up the problem. In the literature that Einar helped inaugurate, and actually we have Ari Rai here, who's also contributed an incredibly important piece of this literature, it's generally acknowledged that the two fundamental normative questions facing social policy and healthcare are the following. One, how much of the overall budget of society's resources should be devoted to healthcare as a matter of general social commitment, leaving discretionary spending to individuals who may wish to do so. And second, how much of that overall budget should be distributed to which individuals for which health needs at which stages of their life. So the first question is how much to allocate aggregately, and the second question is how to distribute that aggregate allocation across different health needs of different individuals at different stages of life. The literature usually begins by recognizing that in this area, unlike others, we can't rely on simply aggregating individual market decisions. Three fundamental reasons for this are, first, the existing background distribution of income and wealth strikes many people as probably not just, and allocating healthcare according to willingness and ability to pay is an especially egregious, for many people, instance of injustice of market distribution. Second, there are individuals with pre-existing conditions or illnesses through no fault of their own who will have more expensive health needs and will either be unable to get health insurance, or if they do, will pay much higher premiums than the rest of the population, and this strikes many people as unfair. Third, acquiring healthcare through insurance introduces a series of problems that Chris has ably discussed already. Fundamentally, people are not cost sensitive. There's a time asymmetry between when you buy the insurance package and when you get the health itself, which makes your choices in either stage perfectly reliable. And finally, there's a phenomenon of hyperbolic discounting, which is that if you buy health at a young age for your older self, you'll have a tendency to discount the benefits you'll get at an older age. And if at the same time we allow the older age person to simply stipulate how much health they want, then they're unaccountable with respect to how much they spent on it in their youth. So fundamentally, there are these three issues that healthcare presents. A, the poor. B, differential needs of the disabled. And three, age. And what I want to now outline is how one approach, which I find to be a plausible beginning, is cost effectiveness analysis, which suggests that to ration between these questions within an overall budget, what we ought to do, ideally, is to try to figure out how much different interventions provide in terms of health benefit on average for different people with different conditions, and thereby ultimately aim to produce a maximum amount of healthcare benefit per dollar resource spent. So fundamentally, cost effectiveness analysis metrics like QALYs, quality adjusted life years, aim to capture two fundamental ideas. One, they aim to capture an intersocial average understanding of the goodness and badness associated with different health conditions. They have people compare in surveys, or doctors and experts compare how bad is it to have a certain disability, how bad is it to be in a certain state of pain, and how much relief would be provided by different interventions, to try to get a sense of, across many individuals, the measure of goodness and badness of different health outcomes. And then second, which is more controversial, cost effectiveness analysis then suggests what we ought to do ideally is then maximize our bang for the buck in terms of aggregate CEA maximization, or reducing or improving as much as we can the QALYs per dollar. So that's not about measuring health states, but that's about balancing off or trading off across people how much each person should get. It's an implicit idea of what is fair across the population. And the fairness judgment in CEA maximization is what's fair is to maximize aggregate health per dollar. So this fairness judgment involves a number of controversies which have been raised, and I just wanted to focus mainly on one, but let me just mention a couple others. One is, some people find it controversial that how much health you get, how much interventions you get, is a function of how long an intervention can prolong your life. So the idea is if one person gets 20 more years, the other person gets 10 more years, everything else being equal, the intervention goes to the person whose life is prolonged by 20 years. Most people find that persuasive when it's 20 versus 10 years, but if you make it 20 years versus 19 years and 10 months, people start balking. So there's this idea that it's problematic to allocate healthcare according to how much life years will be extended. Another issue is that some people feel that a trade-off between life and mere quality of life shouldn't be made in the way quality suggests. Quality suggests that they're on the same scale, that at some point it's trade-offable to extend one person's life for a year versus another person simply massively improving the quality of their life for a year. Many people think saving life is somehow lexically prior, qualitatively different than any form of health improvement. I'm going to bracket those two questions in my discussion here and focus on a third question that's raised by using a quality approach. And that third question is that qualities systematically may be biased against those who have pre-existing health conditions or illnesses, those who are disabled. And I'm going to quickly discuss, well, there's three sorts of instances where this can happen. One, which I'll call plateauing or trailing off. Someone who has a disability, someone who has a chronic health condition, may simply not be able to be brought up to the same stage of health as someone without that disability, although they can still be consistently improved in increasingly small increments. So more and more resources can be devoted to improving them less and less. But nevertheless, they'll never quite reach, or they won't reach the same status as people without that disability without an exorbitant amount of resources. So this is the sort of trailing off or plateauing issue. Then there's a second one, which is comorbidity. Someone who has a pre-existing health condition, say some sort of a mobility problem, may be able to benefit less from a health intervention than someone without that pre-existing condition. A hip replacement may be able to provide more health benefit for someone who's otherwise healthy than for someone who's got some other pre-existing condition. So the disability can affect the prognosis from a specific health intervention. So this is a comorbidity problem. And then the third problem is that if you take into account a background disability, someone is blind, someone has hearing impairment, and then ask who should get this heart surgery, someone without the disability, someone with the disability, qualities as a measure of their overall life, you will tend to favor giving health improvements and health interventions to those who otherwise have no disability, because they're in general enjoying more health. And if you want to improve population health, it's better to help people who don't have pre-existing conditions to reattain full health than to help people who have already pre-existing disability conditions. So these are the three cases. Einer's approach to the question is to suggest that, and it's an approach that in fact already Rise taken to some extent, Dan Brock, a number of very powerful, subtle thinkers have decided that there's two approaches that are problematic. One approach is to simply maximize health benefits across all three cases and provide health interventions according to how much you will get marginal improvements, which means that in each case, the person with a disability will be disadvantaged. They find that troubling for the third case. The third case being the one in which there's an unrelated background disability. There they suggest that in fact, the unrelated background disability should not be factored in. And if someone with a disability can improve as much with this intervention with respect to this condition, then someone without the disability, they should be treated equally. There should be a non-discrimination principle with respect to unrelated background conditions. But at the same time, they don't think that disability shouldn't be factored in the first two cases, and they accept the principle that we should probably aim to maximize health benefits in the first two cases, which will result in systematically giving less resources to those with pre-existing conditions. And so it's a mix between a utilitarian approach or a maximization approach for the first two cases, and then a kind of rights approach of non-discrimination for the last case. And it seems to me this approach is problematic for two reasons. First, it doesn't provide a persuasive principled reason why the last case is different than the first two. Why is it that in the case where someone's background disability will affect their overall health, we don't factor it in, but when their disability will affect how much they can reap improvements from this intervention, we do factor it in. If you want to systematically improve population health, it would seem you want to factor in overall health levels in both cases. I think it's more problematic for a second reason, which is that I think the idea that those with pre-existing conditions should only be assisted in the first two cases when their marginal improvement will be as much or more than those without a background condition is itself normatively troubling. I think in general, health benefit maximization is a troubling systematic principle to pursue. And so what I want to now suggest is an alternative approach to health benefit maximization, or what I think Einer suggests, which is health benefits maximization restricted or qualified by a kind of anti-discriminatory principles in certain intuitive cases. And this alternative approach, what I want to suggest, is a distributive justice approach, which basically suggests that fundamentally what's going on in all these differential needs cases has to be understood in terms of fairness across persons with respect to access to resources for enjoying maximal health in line with other people's legitimate claims. And what that means, in the way I understand it, is to reject two basic premises that divide most of the philosophical literature. The first premise is that maximization or efficiency across a group is in itself somehow valuable. It seems to me maximization or efficiency across the group is simply an incoherent and senseless goal to pursue in the abstract. In the abstract, what we don't want is a large aggregate amount of happiness. That would require having more and more people who are on average maybe less and less happy, but there's more of them. And that in itself is good somehow because there's an aggregately high amount of happiness in the world. This seems to be risky. And what seems to be more plausible is that this idea of maximizing the average or the aggregate captures something, which is that everything else being equal, two principles of of normative commitment captured by utilitarianism are true. One, numbers matter in making decisions across people, so that if you can help two people out, it's better with the same benefit than one. That's better to do. That's one principle in utilitarianism, which I think is plausible. And the other, the one relevant here, is everything else being equal, marginal improvements are relevant considerations in interpersonal fairness. If A can be helped out 10 and B can be helped out 9, if there's no other information we have about their desert or any other aspects of their life, then it seems plausible that we should help out A more than B. How much we can help each person out marginally would seem to be a relevant fairness consideration. That seems to me right. But that's not about maximizing an average or an aggregate. That's about looking at marginal improvements as a relevant normative consideration. Then the other view in the philosophical literature is that we should somehow seek to equalize outcomes. This seems to me equally unpersuasive and arguably senseless. In the abstract, what we're interested in, I want to suggest, is not equal outcomes. As if it's okay if two people who never know each other, one is at 10 and the other is at 5, that's an inequality, they're never going to meet. And it's a better society if A, who's no longer at 10, is at 8, because now 8 and 5 is more equal. Equalizing counsels leveling down in principle. That in principle it's better, even if people don't know each other, that their lots in life be more equal, even if they're overall less well off each. But that seems to me unpersuasive. Equality masks what we really care about, which is fairness with respect to overall levels, which means that what we want to do is, everything else being equal, someone who is worse off than another should probably be given a greater claim over resources, not because we want to equalize, but because fairness demands priority to the worse off vis-a-vis others, where no other considerations are at play. So I suggest if you have these two principles, dislocated from equality and dislocated from maximization. One, fairness says, to each according to marginal improvement is a relevant consideration. When someone can be improved more than another, they get greater claim. The other claim is, when someone's overall level of well-being is worse off than the other, they get a greater claim. And I suggest there's a very intuitive, natural, plausible way to combine these two principles, which is the principle I suggest, which is called the principle of proportionate benefit sacrifice, which is the idea that between two people, neither of whom has deserved the resource in terms of past responsibility, in terms of earning the resource or putting themselves in this state. So we're not factoring in considerations of responsibility or desert. Between these two people, there are two relevant factors that have to be looked at. One, how much can each be improved in terms of health or some other function of improvement? And two, how badly off is, or how well off are their lives going overall? So if there's a trade-off between, say, me and Einar with respect to a claim on resources, and assume he can improve more in health than I can, and his life is going off, his health overall is better than mine, the argument I would suggest is the following, that I have a greater claim to the resource than Einar, given the fact that he already enjoys overall greater health than me. Fairness demands that if neither of us have deserved our lots, I be brought up before he be improved further. But he's got a claim, which is, if he's going to improve more than I am, stand to reap greater gains, fairness also demands that that be factored in, so that I'm not given any incrementally small improvement at the expense of large sacrifices for him, simply because I'm still worse off. That would counsel a bottomless pit. And so fundamentally I'm suggesting what we look at is, how much improvement does each person stand to reap as a function of how well overall their life or health is. And that way, I suggest, provides a plausible reconciliation of our intuitions in all three cases, in that we always factor in for the disabled the fact that their overall health is worse off, but we always also factor in the fact that they may not improve as much as others, and that both are always and systematically to be factored in, rather than one factored in exclusively in some cases, the other factored in exclusively in other cases, and sometimes both ignored with some third metric or third approach, which is not systematic but intuitive and ad hoc. Okay, 30 minutes on. No, 10 minutes on. Great, thanks.